So there's a couple different ways that the flow happens. So the monetary base gets into the system in a couple of different ways. One is through fractional reserve banking, and the other is through treasury auctions and open market operations. So I'm going to do a little test here. Is everybody familiar with these concepts? If you are, I can skip this, but to the extent you're not, I have a little thing here we'll do. Let's hand these up, just pass these around. Take one and pass them around, please. And hold it, yeah.
Oh, nice. Can you keep this?
You can. Not very valuable.
I shouldn't have. I should have looked before I asked.
Get Chinese mayor?
So basically, I've just handed you guys $10 billion each. All right? Sorry, you guys got left out.
I'll lower you some
No.
for a fee.
They work for the small banks, not the big money center banks. So basically, there should be 10 pennies in there. So what I want you to do is pretend that you've got 10 billion in deposits. Well, you're a banker. You don't make any money by having 10 billion in deposits. You actually owe money on 10 billion in deposits. So keep one penny and throw the others into the middle of the table. Okay. So the middle of the table is the economy. Okay, you guys are the banks, and the middle of the table is the economy. Now, when you put that money into the economy, you loaned it to John, who went and bought a car, and the guy that owned the car put it in his bank, and the bank lent it out again, et cetera, et cetera. They always keep 10%. So if you look at this slide here, you know, the first deposit's 1,000, then it's a 900, then it's 890, you keep going on and on, 810, then it's 729, 656. Eventually, $1,000 will become $10,000. So the system is levered up 10 times. So here's the thing. So this is all the money in the system. There's no more money. This is it. So you guys have loaned that money out. Now a year comes later. What do you guys want? Since you guys loaned the money, what do you guys want to receive? You want to receive interest, right? Okay, so where does the interest come from?
The economy.
The circulating money.
Right. Okay, so what happens if 2008 comes along and the money no longer circulates? Where does the money come from to pay the interest?
China.
You either print it or you default on it, right? So that's where the Fed comes in. If the shark stops moving, the economy will die unless the Fed will come in and print it. Okay? Now there's another way that they can get money into this. So that's one of the flows that's important. There's another flow that's important too. I'm going to sell you guys some treasury bonds. So there's a treasury bond, there's a treasury bond, there's a treasury bond, there's a treasury bond, et cetera, okay? And in exchange for those treasury bonds, you guys give me pennies, okay? So because I don't have any money, I'm the government, but I don't have any money, we're broke. So I give you the treasury bonds, you guys give me the pennies, I go and put them in the Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve then goes and pays the government contractors.
You meaning the Treasury Department?
Yeah, I'm the Treasury Department. So the Treasury Department sells the bonds to you guys. I give you guys the bonds. You guys are the banks, remember. So now the banks have the bonds on their balance sheet. You give me the cash. The Treasury gives the cash to the Fed. The Fed goes back and pays whoever the government owes, you know, defense contractors, computer systems operators, whatever it is. Those companies that just received the cash, they go back and they put it back in your banks. So now you guys are getting the money back again, okay? And then you loan it out like you did before. If you guys get it back and don't loan it out, the economy dies again. And they have to print more. Or sell more treasury bonds. They either have to print more or sell more treasury bonds. So now there's one other way they get money into the system. Those treasury bonds I just sold you, I print new money, give you that new money, and you give me back the treasury bonds. Now the money that I'm giving you for those treasury bonds does not currently exist. They're literally made up out of thin air. So there's another definition for that, and it's called kiting checks, which is illegal. So if you or I do it, we get thrown in jail. If the government does it, it's standard operating procedure. Okay, so we've talked about the flow a little bit, and we've talked about the base a little bit. The relationship between the money velocity, or the flow of money, and the monetary base, as we've seen, is very important. But right now, let's focus. So you can see on this graph right here, you can see for the last 10 years, monetary velocity has been crashing. And it's at the lowest level it's ever been. That's why the Fed has to print $85 billion a month, to get the money in the system to keep the flow going. Because the bank reserves, those pennies the 1 penny that you kept in front of you, those are bank reserves. So that money actually exists. So you can either keep it in your own bank vault, or you can put it back on, you can have an account back at the Fed. That's called a Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve account. But either way, so that money exists, and then if there's any physical currency in circulation. So right now, there's about $1 million of physical currency in circulation. That's the dollars that we have, our physical dollars we have in our pockets. And there's about $1.5 trillion, $1 trillion of physical currency, and $1.5 trillion approximately of these bank reserves that has not been fractionally lent out.
And the Fed is
Physical?
There's $1 trillion of physical currency.
Really?
Yeah. So you can
The Fed is
see
paying,
you can see this grade. You can see how quickly it's been rising. I mean, it's becoming
What's the timeline?
it's becoming exponential as well.
What's
that
the timeline?
timeline is from 1950. So the point is we're getting into a situation where the growth curve is becoming exponential.
And the Fed is paying interest on these reserves.
The
for
Fed
the
is
first time
paying
ever,
interest.
right?
That's the other thing. So if you guys keep them in your own bank, that penny in your own bank, you don't get interest. But if you give them back to me and put them as a Fed, as a reserve at the Fed, then I'll pay you interest on
But
it.
it used to be that the Fed didn't pay.
Yeah, they just changed that in what, 2008, 2009?
I think so.
Yeah, that's the first time they've done that. They paid interest on reserves held at the Fed.
Right. So, and it's not very much, but it's enough that they're making risk-free profits. Absolutely risk-free profits. And that's one of the things that the Fed has been trying to do for the last 4 or 5 years is let these banks earn their way out of the problems that they have. Not only are they taking the bad loans off their balance sheets, they're giving them risk-free
But in
profits.
fact, isn't that interest another form of money here? Money
Absolutely.
injection, right? 'Cause that's
Absolutely.
printed out.
It's more flow. Absolutely.
Right.
And in any counterfeiting scheme, the people that receive the money first benefit the most.
Yeah.
So in all of these ways that the money gets into the economy, it first goes to the banks. So the banks benefit the most.
Excuse me, when you say print more money, is that just electronic
Yes,
creation?
sorry.
And
Sorry.
not the
Yeah.
physical
Right.
$100 bill?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a misnomer. They're not necessarily physically printing, although you can see that they're doing that too. They are increasing the physical currency in circulation, but not as a fast of a rate as they are with the other ways that we're talking about.
Because there's an actual cost associated with.
Sure. So okay, so now let's just talk about the monetary base for a second, because this is, I think the monetary, well, they're both important, but the monetary base is in my mind the heart of it all. So if we've got $2.5 trillion down here, the monetary supply is around 15 trillion. Again, it depends on which aggregates you're using. Some people say 10 trillion, some people say 20, but you know, there's a graph here that kind of shows it's around 15 trillion. So this is kind of the same point though. You know, you got the base money down here, all the money up here, so you've got $2.5 trillion, and on top of it is 12 trillion that's been loaned into existence. That 12 trillion generates interest every year.
So the 12 is from the fractional reserve
Exactly.
multiplier, right?
Exactly. Now, if there's even just 1% interest on those loans that have been loaned into existence, that's $120 billion a year that is owed every year. So $120 billion has to get put, the money has to be circling fast enough to pay at least that $120 billion. And if it's not, then that's when the Fed has to come in and plug the hole. So let me, so yeah, so there's two places it can come, the money can come. It can come from either the money circulating, or if the money's not circulating, then they plug the hole with the, you know, printing more money, so to speak. Okay, so what are the implications of this? Well, number one, That's why back in 1971, your grandfather could buy a Cadillac for $10,000, and today it costs $80,000. That's why they could buy a house in San Francisco for $45,000, and now it costs $4.5 million. Part of it is demand and supply, but a lot of it is just the monetary base being increased. You can see, right, this is a graph of the government debt from I think it's 1938 until now. And the big vertical line is 1971. What happened? Does anybody know what happened in 1971? Went off the gold standard. Up until then, anybody who bought our treasury bonds could turn the treasury bonds back in and get gold. Well, in the 70s, or in the 60s and 70s, Kennedy and Nixon, who was between the two? Johnson. Yeah, they had the guns and butter programs where they wanted to fight wars and provide all these benefits for people at home. And they printed so much money so quickly, and the debt went up so quickly that the foreign governments that had been buying our bonds started to get scared. And I think it was Chirac who was like the lead president. The president of France was kind of the lead proponent of turning his treasury bonds back in for gold.
To gold.
And so he gave the treasury bonds back to the treasury gave him the gold for it, and they shipped them back to France. And it started happening at such a quick rate that Lloyd Bentsen, who was the treasury secretary at the time, walked into Nixon and said, "We've got to do something, we're losing all our gold." So we had about 18 tons of gold, 1965, say, and by 1971 it was down to 8,000. So 18,000 tons of gold in the 60s. And by 1971, it was down to 8,000 tons or 8,500 tons or something along those lines.
So the exchange rate was fixed, right, between dollars and gold?
$35.
Right.
No, I'm sorry. It was $21. So that was the first default. So we basically defaulted on the agreement. And I think Benson had a famous line that said, it's our currency, but it's your problem, or something to that effect. So at that point, politicians were no longer constrained by the potentiality of losing our gold, so they could spend more and not lose the gold. And the gold, at the end of the day, the gold is the most important thing. All the central banks hold gold because it's the ultimate form of payment. We can get into that in a little bit more in a little bit.
So when we went off the gold standard, all the guys who had dollars, they would have become less valuable to them because they can't.
Absolutely.
So was there a drop in the dollar relative to other currencies at that time? Would have been like, hey, I want to get out of this, get into the yen or whatever.
Well, effectively,
It was the pound.
I don't know. I honestly don't know exactly what the exchange rates did. But as soon as Nixon confiscated all the gold, or that was 1979. Sorry, when I took this off. Sorry, I'm mixing the two up now. So it was $35 an ounce up until 1971. Sorry, I'm mixing the two events up. But it essentially, what followed was the 1970s, which in America at least was one of the greatest periods of inflation that we've had. And you can see this is broken up by different administrations, and it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats. Everybody spends more money than they can. Nobody wants to make any cuts. So you can see here that in the last 40 years, the dollar's lost 83% of its value.
In the last
Yeah.
40 years?
In the last 40 years, since 1971.
And since 1913, how much is it left?
It's like 95% or something. Yeah, so it's I mean, and it's very abstract, so a lot of people don't really understand it, but it's really the same thing as buying a stock and selling it for 80% less than you bought it for. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the equivalent thing. And here's our budget deficit looking out for the next 7 years. So we're spending another $7 trillion that we don't have. So the best case scenario, 6 or 7 years from now, the national debt's 25 trillion, not 17 trillion. And that's being conservative. So this is really where it starts to make me mad. I think this is the presentation that you saw and forwarded to Ed was, I just fundamentally believe you cannot borrow your way out of debt. It does not work. You cannot spend your way to prosperity. If you could, Argentina and Tanzania and Zimbabwe, they would be the richest countries in the world. And Japan the same way. You can't do it. You have to eliminate the debt. But the way it is now is per person, the national debt is about $50,000. That's bad enough. But if you take into account all the unfunded liabilities, it's $350,000. So my son, who's 4 years old, owes $350,000. Never been to Disneyland, never played in a basketball game, never been on a date, never had a job, he owes $350,000. And these are not abstract numbers. These are contractually obligated payments that must be made. And if they're not made, it's a default. And if it's a default, then you cascade the whole system again, just like we had in 2008. So it's a very, very big problem. It's indentured servitude, for lack of a better word.
Won't the cascade be kind of worse than 2008?
I would say so, yes. So at the end of the day, how does this happen? How did we get to this point? Well, it's not just about going off the gold standard. It's really the fact that there's no, in my opinion, budget control. Because even if we were on a gold standard, when we were on a gold standard in the 60s, the politicians still spent more than they could afford, and that's why we started losing our gold. So you really need to have some kind of a check on the ability to spend more or run a budget deficit. Now here's these guys. Here's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that these guys are working on it. The bad news is they're not on your side. And anybody who thinks that the central bankers are on your side, I'm sorry, they are not on your side. The central bankers are a trade federation for the banks. They are owned by the banks. They work for the banks. It's no different than a software industry federation. It's nothing different than a manufacturing syndicate. They are a syndicate for the banks.
I would add that, they work for the banks, and the Fed is a private organization.
Yeah.
But they are allowed to
charter
be that way
private
because the
bank.
government
Absolutely.
government can change that at any time, right?
Sure.
It's a government.
It's